Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, January 15th, 2025. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com. Blinken says Hamas has made up for its lost fighters. So on Tuesday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken delivered a speech at the Atlantic Council where he said Hamas has likely recruited as many fighters as it has lost in Gaza. But before he got to those comments, his speech was disrupted by a protester who called him the Secretary of Genocide for his role in supporting and enabling Israel's genocidal war in Gaza. The protester yelled, quote, "You will forever be known as Bloody Blinken, Secretary of Genocide. You have the blood of hundreds of thousands of innocent people on your hands," end quote. And I hope that these things happen to Blinken in his post-State Department career, which I'm sure is going to involve some sort of think tank where he's going to be giving speeches. So I hope he continues to be disrupted for not only his role in Gaza, but his role in the Ukraine proxy war and other conflicts and economic warfare he's been involved in. So Blinken went on to criticize Israel's strategy in Gaza despite backing it for nearly a year and a half. Despite enabling and supporting this genocide, and now here he is towards the end, the final week of the Biden administration, and he has some criticisms for Israel. He said, quote, "We've long made the point to the Israeli government that Hamas cannot be defeated by a military campaign alone, that without a clear alternative, a post-conflict plan, and a credible political horizon for the Palestinians, Hamas, or something just as abhorrent and dangerous, will grow back," end quote. And he noted that Israel was still facing resistance in places like North Gaza, even though they've completely destroyed most of the buildings, almost all the buildings in sight there. Blinken said, quote, "That's exactly what's happened in northern Gaza since October 7th. Each time Israel completes its military operations and pulls back, Hamas militants regroup and reemerge because nothing else will fill the void," end quote. He also said that the U.S. assesses, quote, "that Hamas has recruited almost as many new militants as it has lost. That is a recipe for an enduring insurgency and perpetual war," end quote. So, and this is, based on U.S. intelligence assessments. That's what the U.S. has assessed. And going back to November 2023, General Charles Q. Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest ranking U.S. military officer, warned that Israel's killing of so many civilians in Gaza would create more Hamas members. Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, has said similar things. Despite the U.S. saying and acknowledging that Israel's strategy would just create more Hamas fighters, the U.S. backed them to the hilt this whole time, giving them everything that they want. And that's why we've seen Israel, go for what they've been doing in North Gaza, just removing everyone and demolishing everything. Because that's the only way that they can really win, is just by conquering and destroying, the whole place. But anyway, despite Brown recognizing this reality, the U.S. continued to provide all this military aid. And according to the Times of Israel, Israel assesses that it has killed 18,000 Hamas fighters. But we know we cannot trust Israel's numbers because there was recently that report from Haaretz, and there's been other reports that said similar things, that the IDF frequently kills unarmed civilians and counts them as terrorists. In one case, they killed 200 people, and they confirmed that 10 of them were Hamas militants, but they counted all of them as terrorists. So Blinken's address at the Atlantic Council came amid reports that a hostage and ceasefire deal is close. We're going to get more into that in another story. And basically, he still pushed the narrative that Hamas has been the one impeding the progress. Hamas has been the obstacle to a ceasefire, even though it's very clearly been Netanyahu. That's been acknowledged by many Israeli officials, Israeli media outlets. But Netanyahu is still pushing this narrative that it's Hamas's fault. He said, quote, "For the past several months, Hamas has played the spoiler. But over the past several weeks, our intensive efforts have brought us to the brink of a final agreement," end quote. So, and according to Israeli media, the actual difference that's made progress was pressure from Steve Witkoff, Trump's incoming Middle East envoy. Not even, nothing that Blinken or anyone else in the Biden administration did. And it just goes to show that they wanted this war, that they were just letting Israel do whatever it wants and not putting any real pressure on them to end this, even though he has all this criticism now of the Israeli military campaign. All right, so the next one here, Israeli strikes kill 63 Palestinians in Gaza amid talk of truce. So amid reports that a Gaza ceasefire deal is advancing, Israeli strikes continue to pound the strip on Tuesday, killing at least 63 Palestinians since dawn, medical sources told Al Jazeera early Wednesday morning. So among the dead, sorry, I should have warned you, this picture is really rough here. It's 2 dead children. One is an infant. The pictures were particularly brutal, even though, there's just, if anybody's been on social media today or you're looking at the news headlines, all the talk is about this potential ceasefire, but the violence seems like it's gotten worse in Gaza. Among the dead were 2 children killed by an Israeli attack while sheltering in a tent in the Nusayrat refugee camp in central Gaza. So more children slaughtered while in tents. Sources told Al Jazeera that a total of 28 Palestinians were killed in central and southern Gaza. And that was earlier in the day. The death toll has gotten higher since then in those parts of Gaza. So again, this picture is very rough. You see a dead infant and another very young child who was killed. And this is in Deir al-Balah in central Gaza. So Israeli strikes also hit northern Gaza, killing several Palestinians in Gaza City. On Tuesday night, an Israeli strike on a building sheltering displaced Palestinians in Deir al-Balah killed at least 13 Palestinians. So Hani Mahmoud, an Al Jazeera reporter in central Gaza, said that there was cautious optimism among Palestinians over the reports of a ceasefire deal being close. He said, quote, "Everybody's anxious and waiting, but there are still people who keep saying that they have been let down so many times in the past. There is still caution surrounding their optimism, given that there was no ceasefire deal in the past. They remember when they were told the last time there were talks in Cairo, the Israeli military invaded the northern part of the Gaza Strip," end quote. Again, just horrific situation in Gaza. So the next one here. Report says Israel and Hamas agreed on a deal in principle. So CBS News reported on Tuesday that both Israel and Hamas have agreed in principle to a draft hostage and ceasefire deal that could be finalized this week. The report, which cited U.S., Arab, and Israeli officials, said if the final details are worked out and the Israeli government approves it, the deal could be implemented as soon as this weekend before the January 20th inauguration of President-elect Donald Trump. The Associated Press had a similar report that said Hamas had accepted a draft deal and that the details were still being finalized before Israeli approval. The deal is largely based on a proposal President Biden put forward in May 2024, which Hamas accepted months ago. They accepted it at the time. And according to Israeli media reports, as I mentioned, pressure on Netanyahu from Trump's incoming Middle East envoy is the reason why there's been progress in recent days. You see this picture here. This is a photo of North Gaza as seen from Israel. You see just the complete destruction. And this deal involves 3 phases, but according to AP, and this is a very important detail, it would not commit Israel to a permanent ceasefire or full withdrawal from Gaza. So the AP report says details of the second phase still must be negotiated during the first. Those details remain difficult to resolve, and the deal does not include written guarantees that the ceasefire will continue until a deal is reached. That means Israel could resume its military campaign after the first phase ends. And according to all the media reports, the first phase involves a 42-day ceasefire. And during that time, Hamas would release 33 Israeli hostages, including women, children, the elderly, and 5 female IDF soldiers. Some of the hostages released in the first phase may be dead, but Israeli officials say they believe most of them are still alive. And in exchange, Israel is expected to release hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. So during the first phase, Israeli troops will withdraw from population centers in Gaza. And according to these reports, they're saying that Palestinians will be able to return to North Gaza. But again, look at North Gaza. I mean, where do they have to return? And I know the situation for Palestinians, I've seen a lot of them have gone to their homes, in other parts of Gaza. I saw one report recently in Khan Yunis of a family just living in the rubble of what was their home because they would just rather be there. So I'm sure, even though it's destroyed, if they have the chance, Palestinians will return. But I will be surprised, again, if Israel actually lets that happen. They want to keep this area cleansed of the Palestinians. So where were we here? And then during the first phase, aid deliveries will also be surged with 600 trucks per day expected to enter the Strip. The second phase of the deal would involve the release of all male Israeli hostages and a full IDF withdrawal, but many details still need to be worked out for the second phase. Again, the negotiations for the second phase won't happen until the first phase, after the first phase starts. And then the third phase would involve the exchange of bodies and the start of reconstruction in Gaza. So let's hope that this whole thing is implemented and that it ends for good. I hope that there's just some kind of ceasefire. The Palestinians need relief. They need more aid to come in. And then even if it is, it'll be hard for Israel to restart, if they go through the whole first phase, 42 whole days of peace and calm in the region. I think it would be hard for Israel to restart. So let's just hope that this thing actually happens. I'm still skeptical until we actually see something signed. All right, so the next one here, Israel's Gvir threatens to quit the government over the ceasefire deal. So on Tuesday, Israeli Security Minister Itamar Gvir threatened to quit the government if Netanyahu agreed to a hostage and ceasefire deal that's being negotiated in Qatar. And Gvir called for Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich to join him. So Gvir has been opposed to any kind of ceasefire deal in Gaza as he favors the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from Gaza and the establishment of Jewish settlements. And he's on the record saying, that he wants both of those things again and again. In a post on X, he took credit for preventing a deal like this from happening earlier. He said, quote, "Over the past year, through our political power, we have managed to prevent this deal from coming to fruition time after time," end quote. So there's Gvir saying the reason why there's been no ceasefire deal is because of us. It's not because of Hamas. It's because of this government, this Israeli government. So Gvir's Jewish Power Party and Smotrich's Religious Zionism Party, they've had significant leverage over Netanyahu because if they leave the government, the coalition would lose the majority in the Knesset, and that could potentially lead to new elections. So Smotrich has also come out strongly against the ceasefire, but he did not threaten to quit the government if the deal signed. He didn't explicitly say that. So Gvir said, quote, "I call on my friend, Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, to join me in full cooperation against the terrible deal being crafted and to inform the Prime Minister clearly and firmly that if the deal goes through, we will resign from the government together," end quote. He says the only way Netanyahu will not sign the deal is if the force opposing it is large enough to prevent him from doing so. So another factor in this is that Yair Lapid, the former Israeli prime minister, he's the leader of the opposition. He has said, and he said it again on Monday, that he would help Netanyahu stay in power. Basically sounds like maybe join the government so Netanyahu doesn't have to worry about elections or anything like that. And he reiterated this offer on Monday. So there's a potential lifeline there for Netanyahu if he signs the deal and Smotrich and Gvir quit. But this is pressure on Netanyahu. And again, nothing's done until it's done. So this is one of the factors that could prevent a deal here. All right, so the next one here, Zelensky and Macron talk Ukraine troops deployment. So on Monday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that he spoke with his French counterpart, Emmanuel Macron, and discussed the idea of a possible deployment of French troops to Ukraine as part of a potential future security guarantee. Zelensky said that he and Macron discussed achieving peace and developing effective security guarantees. He wrote on X, quote, "As one such guarantee, we discussed the French initiative to deploy military contingents in Ukraine. We addressed practical steps for its implementation, potential expansion, and the involvement of other nations in this effort," end quote. So Russia would never agree to a NATO deployment in Ukraine as part of a potential future peace plan, since one of its main demands for any kind of deal is Ukrainian neutrality. The Wall Street Journal recently reported that Trump has actually suggested the idea of European peacekeeping troops being deployed to Ukraine to monitor the ceasefire. Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has already rejected this idea, saying that basically it's not acceptable to Russia. And Macron, he's been really trying to get troops over there. You know, it's last year he was like constantly talking about sending troops. He said he was finalizing a plan to send troops to Ukraine to train Ukrainian soldiers, but he backed down, and it was probably because Russia was saying, if you send troops, they're a legitimate target. Now, we know that there's been a small number of NATO special operations troops inside Ukraine, but you know what he was talking about was like a big public open deployment. So that's what Zelensky and Macron are talking about. The next one here, Ukraine claims to hit Russia with the largest missile and drone attacks. So this one's from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. Ukrainian officials said they bombarded Russia with a massive missile and drone attack. Ukrainian officials said that the drone attack on Monday night was the largest that they launched against Russia since the start of the war. Russian sources said that over 200 Ukrainian drones and missiles were downed. Kiev says that it targeted Russian weapons production plants, oil refineries, and warehouses. Russian sources reported the munitions hit industrial and energy infrastructure. Among the targets, the Kremlin says, is the Turk Stream pipeline, the pipeline that carries gas from Russia through the Black Sea and onto western Turkey. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov blasted Washington for the Ukrainian attack on the pipeline. He said, quote, "The U.S. does not tolerate competition in any sphere, including energy. They are recklessly endorsing terrorist activities aimed at undermining the energy stability of the European Union. They are encouraging their Ukrainian proxies to disable Turk Stream following the sabotage of Nord Stream," end quote. So Russia, again, the exact extent of the damage in this big attack is unclear. Russia said that they downed 200 drones, but there's also reports of energy infrastructure and everything being hit. But this is a pretty significant number of drones, and I think some U.S. ATACMs were involved in these strikes as well. All right, so the next one here, Israel continues ceasefire violations in Lebanon. This one is from Jason Ditz. With around 12 days remaining in the 60-day Israel ceasefire with Lebanon, Israel continues to commit multiple violations per day. A number of airstrikes are being conducted in southern and eastern Lebanon, along with a systematic destruction of civilian homes in villages near the Israeli border. Israel, so only 12 days left. Israel is supposed to entirely withdraw its military from Lebanese territory by the end of the ceasefire. The U.S. Special Envoy has guaranteed that will happen, though there remain substantial questions about that, and the places Israel has left have been more or less destroyed during their occupation. Whether the pullout happens in the next couple of weeks or not, Lebanon will have its work cut out for it in trying to rebuild after the Israeli invasion. Israel, a lot of these areas that Israel bombed in Lebanon, they leveled entire apartment buildings, and a lot of these areas look like Gaza. Obviously on a smaller scale, but I mean, the destruction that we see in some of these cities and towns, just huge. And Prime Minister designate Nawaf Salam, the ICJ president, he is promising to see destroyed homes rebuilt and for Lebanon to start a new phase of progress and opportunities. So he has to form a government still. I think there's still some questions about that, if he'll get enough support and everything. I mean, he probably will since he was nominated for this position, but that's a whole nother thing. The Lebanese, the whole political system in Lebanon, all the different factions and everything is kind of complicated, and it's interesting, but it's can be confusing. But right now, the situation is he's been nominated to be the prime minister, and he needs to form a government. And as far as I understand it, he's being replaced at the ICJ by a pro-Israel judge, which that does not bode well for the ICJ genocide case against Israel. All right, so the next one here, Israel admits that its soldiers used ambulance in a West Bank raid. So this article is from The Guardian. The ambulance pulls up on a narrow street at the Balada Palestinian refugee camp in Nablus in the West Bank, seemingly no different from one of the many emergency vehicles that drive in the area every day. But then 5 armed Israeli soldiers emerge from the vehicle, going on to take part in a raid that results in the death of 2 civilians, including an 80-year-old woman, in an incident that Israel's army admitted constituted a serious offense and violation of existing orders and procedures. The Guardian has reviewed video captured by a surveillance camera, spoken with witnesses, and a survivor of the military operation conducted by the IDF on December 19th, 2024, using a hospital vehicle with Palestinian license plates. It was described by rights groups as a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law, which prohibits the use of medical vehicles to carry out military attacks that result in injury or death of people. So B'Tselem, the Israeli rights group, said about the incident, quote, Israel is no longer trying to hide its war crimes and is acting as though the norms and rules of international law do not apply, end quote. So I remember covering this at the time when I think I mentioned it on this show, when this elderly woman, this 80-year-old woman, was killed by Israeli forces in the West Bank. And there was reports that said they used an ambulance, and now it's confirmed. And this is another case that every accusation is a confession. Israel had bombed ambulances, I know, in Lebanon, and claimed that they were being used by Hezbollah. And then here we have Israeli forces using it and admitting it. You know, we have proof that they actually used an ambulance as cover to carry out an attack in the West Bank. All right, so the next one here, Biden to remove Cuba from the terror sponsor list. The Biden administration announced Tuesday that it will remove Cuba from the state sponsor of terrorism list, a move that will likely be reversed by the incoming Trump administration. So, you know, this is good news in that it could lead to sanctions. You know, it is sanctions relief in a way, but there's still, I mean, Cuba's still under the trade embargo. And the fact that they're doing this at the end of the administration, when you have this Trump administration coming in that's going to be very hawkish on Cuba, Venezuela, you know, this probably isn't really going to make much of a difference. But according to U.S. officials, this move is the result of a deal brokered by the Catholic Church that will see Cuba release political prisoners. Cuba's President Miguel Diaz-Canel announced on Tuesday that Cuba will free 553 people and said that he informed Pope Francis. So the Vatican using its diplomatic ability here, I guess, because there is there's a lot of Catholics in Cuba. But removing Cuba from the list will ease sanctions slightly, though the country remains under this decades-old trade embargo. The Cuban Foreign Ministry said in a statement, quote, this decision puts an end to specific coercive measures which, together with many others, seriously damage the Cuban economy and have a severe impact on the population, end quote. So the only other countries listed by the U.S. as state sponsors of terrorism are Iran, North Korea, and Syria. Cuba was first put on the list under the Reagan administration in 1982. The Obama administration removed Cuba in 2015 as part of its steps toward normalization with Havana, but it was relisted in January 2021 by then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. It was one of the Trump administration's last foreign policy moves. So, you know, the problem with Obama took steps to normalize with Cuba, lifted some restrictions, but the Fact is, he didn't fully lift the embargo. He didn't fully lift sanctions and really establish relations. So the Trump administration was able to reverse everything that he did. This is one of the dumbest holdovers from the Cold War, these sanctions on Cuba. The embargo has been in effect since, 1962? And what has it done? We just have this country 90 miles off our coast that we don't even trade with. I mean, it's a complete joke that this is still the arrangement. And, Marco Rubio is coming in as the Secretary of State. He is a huge proponent of keeping sanctions on Cuba. His parents were Cuban immigrants. That's usually the case for whatever reason. People from Cuba, or Cuban Americans, they want to keep the sanctions. They hate the government, I guess because a lot of their families were kicked out by Castro. But it's just, I just think it's so dumb to keep Cuba under sanctions, no matter what you think of the government. Obviously, it hasn't worked. So why not just open up trade, get more tourism in there, whatever. But anyway, so Marco Rubio, he's actually introduced legislation to make it not impossible, but to prohibit removing Cuba from this list. So I am sure that this is going to be one of his first orders of business, is to redesignate them as a state sponsor of terror. And then there's a official Trump's incoming envoy for Latin America. He was asked by the New York Times if the move would be reversed by the next administration, and he said, quote, "There's a process, so it will take time, but in the meantime, we can take other measures that will have even greater impact," end quote. Really what it is, the Democrats, I remember there was a report at the beginning of the Biden administration, because when he ran, when people had asked him about this, he said, I think he said he would go back to the Obama policies and lift more restrictions and sanctions on Cuba. But then when he came into office, there was a report from the Hill that said he's not going to do it because the Democrats want more votes in Miami-Dade County. It's just the fact that Florida is a swing state and the Democrats want more votes from this one county. So a whole country has to remain under a trade embargo, a Cold War trade embargo. And, it's just completely ridiculous. All right, so the last story here, South Korean President Yoon arrested after martial law attempt. So this just broke right before I started recording. But Yoon was trying to avoid arrest, but now they have arrested him. So this is from Al Jazeera. I haven't read this yet, so hopefully I don't mess it up too much. But South Korean investigators have arrested South Korea's impeached President Yoon Suk-yeol over accusations of insurrection for briefly imposing martial law in a move swiftly overturned by the country's National Assembly. The authorities said in a statement, quote, "The Joint Investigation Headquarters executed an arrest warrant for President Yoon Suk-yeol today, January 15th at 10:33 a.m., end quote. In a pre-recorded video message released after his arrest, Yoon said that he had made the decision to submit to questioning over his failed martial law bid to avert bloodshed. He said, quote, "I decided to respond to the Corruption Investigation Office," end quote. He added that he did not accept the legality of the investigation, but was complying to prevent bloodshed. South Korean investigators and police used ladders to climb into Yoon's residential compound after they were initially blocked by the Presidential Security Service, which barricaded the entrance using vehicles, according to reports. So he was really trying to avoid arrest at first. And thousands of people, including supporters, had gathered outside Yoon's home, while a group of lawmakers from the governing Conservative People Power Party and Yoon's lawyers had also attempted to prevent the arrest inside the residential compound, the report said. So they got him, and we'll see where it goes from here. But it was a very tense few days in South Korea while they were trying to arrest him. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Ted Galen Carpenter. Will Trump end Washington's Democratic foreign policy facade? One from David Stockman. Fiscal redemption requires a republic, not an empire. One from William D. Hartung. Angling toward Armageddon, the return of Senator Strangelove. One from Ali Risk. Washington's man in Lebanon. And our spotlight is from Gideon Levy. You're a Nazi speaking out against Israel's war crimes in Gaza. about some of the heat that he's come under for his position, being an Israeli who's very opposed to what's happening in Gaza. So please go check all of that out. You can always support this show by liking, subscribing, sharing the show. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, although it looks like the Supreme Court is not going to block the ban, so TikTok might be banned soon, but hopefully not. But anyway, I will be back with some more news. Thanks for listening.